The restaurant buzzed with chatter and clinking cutlery, but at one corner table, tension hung thicker than the midday sunlight streaming through the windows. A young woman, barely 19, sat nervously, her hearing aids glinting in the light. She was waiting for a blind date, unaware that the evening had been set up as a cruel joke. Across the room, the arabbillionaire CEO, Raid al-Faris, watched from a distance, his eyes sharp, calculating, yet full of quiet concern. He had received an anonymous tip about the situation, a warning that someone intended to humiliate the girl for sport. Most people might have ignored it, choosing to sip their coffee and scroll their devices, but Raid was not most people. He observed the girl fidgeting, glancing anxiously at the door every few seconds. Her patience was being tested, and his heart tightened, not out of pity, but from a deep, instinctive sense of justice. To him, influence and power were meaningless unless used to protect the vulnerable, to act decisively when others failed. As the man finally approached, smirking, confidence thinly veiling mockery, Raid's jaw tightened. This was not just a blind date gone wrong, it was an orchestrated attempt to degrade, and he would not allow it. Without hesitation, he rose from his table, every step deliberate, commanding, yet measured. "Excuse me," Raid's voice cut through the murmurs and clatter, calm but carrying the weight of authority. "I believe you have no right to treat anyone this way." The smirk faltered. Laughter stopped mid-air. Patrons glanced over, sensing the shift. This was no ordinary confrontation. This was power aligned with moral authority, a billionaire not flexing wealth, but enforcing justice and human decency. The girl looked up, confusion and relief battling in her eyes. Raid stepped closer, placing himself between her and the would-be humiliator. Tonight, no one mocks innocence. Tonight, truth is visible, and kindness will prevail. In that instant, the room seemed to hold its breath. The joke that had been planned for humiliation was crumbling before it even began. Raid's presence wasn't just intervention, it was a living lesson in courage, morality, and the responsibility of power. The daylight streamed across the table, catching the worried glances of the girl and the stunned expressions of onlookers. What started as a cruel trick was about to be transformed into a display of justice, empathy, and unyielding moral authority. The smirk on the man's face faltered as Raid al-Faris stepped closer, his posture unyielding, every movement measured with the calm intensity of someone who wielded influence not for show, but for justice. The restaurant had grown quieter. Patrons sensed the shift in energy, the arrival of authority that demanded respect, not fear, but ethical clarity. Raid's eyes scanned the man from head to toe, sharp and unwavering. "You thought it was funny," he said, voice low but piercing, "to humiliate someone simply because they trust the world to be kind. Let me make one thing very clear, that ends now." The man stammered, trying to regain his composure, but Raid's presence filled the room like a tangible force. "You will apologize. Publicly. Not because I asked, but because decency demands it. And if you fail, I will ensure that everyone in this establishment, and everyone who can influence your life, knows exactly who you are and what you attempted." The girl looked up, eyes wide, barely believing the billionaire who had appeared from nowhere was defending her. Relief mingled with lingering fear, but Raid's calm authority reassured her, she was no longer alone. Justice was standing in her corner. Slowly, the man opened his mouth to speak, but the words faltered under the weight of Raid's unwavering gaze. I didn't," he began, then stopped. The room waited, breath held, the tension almost tangible. Raid's tone softened slightly, though it retained its commanding force. "Do not minimize what you tried to do. Recognition of wrongdoing is the first step toward becoming a decent human being. You humiliated someone who cannot defend herself against cruelty, and that is unacceptable." The girl blinked rapidly, tears threatening to spill. She had felt powerless, trapped in an orchestrated humiliation, but now she could see that truth and courage could intervene, that moral authority could rise and protect those without voice. Raid bent slightly, addressing her gently. "You have nothing to fear. Tonight is not about shame, it is about clarity, about teaching that kindness and integrity are stronger than deception and cruelty. Remember this moment. Let it remind you that even in the darkest setups, someone with courage will stand for justice. The patrons murmured softly, some nodding, some shaking their heads in awe. The man who had planned the joke slumped slightly in his chair, realizing that the power dynamic had shifted completely. This was no longer a prank. It was a lesson in morality, delivered with precision, dignity, and unshakable authority. Raid straightened, eyes sweeping across the room. Let this be clear to everyone here. Cruelty has consequences, even in its smallest forms. And empathy, courage, and truth will always prevail when someone chooses to act. The girl's hands trembled slightly as she grasped her glass. For the first time that evening, she felt safe, seen, and validated. The setup designed to humiliate her had been dismantled in a matter of minutes, replaced by a living example of moral courage and the ethical use of power. Raid's presence, his decisive words, and his unwavering authority had transformed the room into more than a restaurant. It had become a stage for justice, compassion, and empowerment, proving that influence wielded rightly could change not just an outcome, but hearts and minds. The tension in the restaurant slowly eased, but Raid al-Faris remained vigilant. His eyes never left the girl, whose name he had learned was Maya, and whose anxiety still lingered despite the instigator's retreating smirk. He understood that humiliation could linger far longer than a single moment, and that true protection required more than intervention. It required reassurance, guidance, and visible moral courage. "Maya," Raid said softly, leaning slightly closer so only she could hear, "you did nothing wrong. You are worthy of respect, and anyone who tried to shame you will face the consequences of their actions." Her lips trembled as she whispered, I didn't expect anyone to stand up for me like this." Raid's gaze softened, though his posture remained commanding. "Most people won't. But there are always those who will act, and today, you witness the difference between power used for cruelty and power used for protection. Remember this, it is not about fear, it is about integrity." The instigator, now pale and subdued, had been escorted quietly to another corner by the restaurant manager, who had clearly been influenced by Raid's authority. It was a subtle, yet firm message. Misdeeds would not go unchecked, even in seemingly private settings. Raid turned his attention back to Maya. "Sometimes, the world will try to trick you, to humiliate you, to take advantage of your vulnerability. But courage does not mean you face it alone. It means standing tall, seeking help, and trusting that justice can arrive, even unexpectedly." Maya's eyes filled with tears, but they were no longer tears of fear, they were tears of relief, of hope, of understanding. For the first time that evening, she felt empowered rather than exposed. Raid had not only intervened in the moment, he had provided her a model of what it meant to act rightly, to wield power ethically, and to protect those without a voice. He handed her a small card, elegantly embossed. "This has my contact. If ever you face injustice, fear, or cruelty, you do not have to face it alone. There are people who will act, people who will protect. And sometimes, you will be the person who gives someone else that hope." Maya looked down at the card, feeling a warmth that went beyond the material. It was symbolic, a tangible reminder that morality and power could intersect to create real change. Across the room, patrons whispered softly among themselves. The atmosphere had shifted entirely. What had begun as a cruel setup had become a living lesson in justice, moral courage, and ethical authority. The instigator, now pale and subdued, could not undo the impact of Raid's actions. Raid glanced at Maya once more, his eyes steady, commanding, yet full of empathy. "Tonight, you saw that truth matters, courage matters, and integrity matters. Keep that with you. Let it guide your actions, your choices, and your interactions with the world. That is the real power." As he rose to leave, Maya's hand trembled slightly as she waved. "Thank you, for everything." Raid nodded once, a subtle smile crossing his lips. "Remember this feeling. And know this, the world can be cruel, but it can also be fair. And sometimes, fairness is created by those who choose to act when others hesitate." The daylight streaming through the windows highlighted the subtle transformation, not just in Maya, but in the room itself. Power wielded with conscience had turned humiliation into dignity, fear into hope, and cruelty into a lesson that would linger long after the evening ended. The restaurant hummed with a quiet tension as Ray Faris lingered near Maya's table, ensuring the aftermath of the incident was fully under control. The instigator, who had tried to turn a blind date into a cruel spectacle, sat at another corner, clearly chastened, not merely by Raid's words, but by the authority, poise, and undeniable presence of a man who wielded influence with moral clarity. Raid stepped toward the manager, who had been nervously observing the scene. "Make sure this individual understands the consequences of their actions," Raid instructed, his voice calm but carrying the weight of unshakable authority. "Humiliation disguised as humor leaves scars. Address it appropriately. Let it be clear, cruelty is never tolerated." The manager nodded swiftly, his respect for Raid evident. "Yes, sir. I'll handle it immediately." Raid returned his attention to Maya. "Do you understand why I intervened?" he asked, his tone gentle yet unwavering. Maya nodded slowly, her fingers clutching the small card he had given her. "Yes, you stood up for me. You showed that someone cares. That people with power can do the right thing." Raid allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. "Exactly. Power is not measured by wealth or status alone. True power is measured by the choices you make, by the courage to act when injustice appears, and by the compassion you extend to those who cannot defend themselves." Maya's eyes shimmered with a mix of awe and gratitude. For the first time, she felt a sense of agency, a quiet confidence that no orchestrated humiliation could erase. Raid's presence had not just saved her from embarrassment, it had taught her the meaning of dignity, courage, and ethical strength. As he prepared to leave, he glanced once more at the instigator, who was now being guided toward a private discussion with the manager. The man's expression had shifted from arrogance to unease. He now fully comprehended the consequences of attempting to exploit another's vulnerability. Raid's intervention had made one thing unmistakably clear: justice would not be optional, and moral authority would not be ignored. Stepping back to Maya, Raid lowered his voice slightly. "Tonight was not just about stopping cruelty. It was about showing you, and everyone present, that one decisive act of courage can reshape an entire situation. Remember this. When you feel powerless, know that someone will act for you. And one day, you too will have the power to act for others." Maya's lips curved into a small, hopeful smile. "I'll remember. I promise." Raid nodded once more, straightening and exuding the calm confidence that marked every decision he made. He left the restaurant, walking into the sunlight streaming through the windows, leaving behind a ripple of ethics, courage, and hope that had transformed not just Maya's evening, but the very atmosphere of the room. By the time he disappeared from view, Maya felt something she had never felt before: unshakable confidence in herself, and the understanding that true justice is enacted by those willing to act when others hesitate. And in that quiet, sunlit restaurant, the lesson lingered in the air. Power exercised with conscience can change lives in ways no joke or cruelty ever could. The next afternoon, Maya found herself replaying the events of the previous evening. What had begun as a cruel setup for mockery had been completely overturned by Raid Faris, the Arabbillionaire CEO whose presence radiated authority and compassion. She could still feel the weight of his intervention, the calm, unwavering power that had shifted an entire room and dismantled humiliation with a single, decisive act. Raid returned to the restaurant, not for show, but to ensure the final threads of justice and emotional closure were tied. He approached Maya with the same calm, purposeful steps that had become synonymous with his presence. "Maya," he began, voice steady yet kind, "I want to make sure you leave today with more than relief. I want you to leave with confidence, strength, and clarity about your own worth." Maya looked up, clutching the card he had given her. I do feel stronger. But I'm still nervous about what happened. About people remembering me like that." Raid shook his head slightly, his gaze firm yet gentle. "No. What people remember is how you carried yourself, even in moments designed to shame you. You did not crumble. You stood with dignity, and courage found you, even when the world tried to hide it." He motioned for her to follow him to a quiet corner of the restaurant. There, he handed her a small journal, elegantly bound. "Write here," he instructed. "Not just about what happened, but about how you overcame it. Document your courage, your thoughts, your victories. In the future, when doubt creeps in, this will remind you of your own strength." Maya's eyes glistened as she accepted the gift. "Thank you, sir, for everything." Raid's expression softened. "This was never about me. It was about showing that justice is not abstract. It is enacted by those who choose to act, who choose to uphold integrity, and who refuse to let cruelty stand unchallenged. You now carry that understanding forward." Meanwhile, the instigator had been confronted privately by the manager, guided firmly but fairly, ensuring they comprehended the moral consequences of their actions. Raid had made certain that accountability was not optional. True power required responsibility, and he had demonstrated that in full. As the afternoon sunlight spilled across the table, Maya felt a profound shift within herself. The humiliation she had feared, the anxiety she had carried, had been replaced with confidence, empowerment, and hope. She understood now that one decisive act of moral courage could transform not just a moment, but a person's entire outlook on life. Raid rose, preparing to leave for the last time. "Remember this," he said, voice resolute and clear. "Kindness and courage are contagious. Integrity is a choice. Power without conscience is empty, but when wielded rightly, it can reshape lives. You will never forget this moment, and neither will anyone who witnessed it." Maya smiled, a radiant mixture of relief and newfound strength. "I'll remember, sir. I promise." Raid nodded once, his presence as commanding and composed as ever. As he walked out into the sunlight, the lesson lingered. True influence is measured by courage, compassion, and the decisiveness to protect those without voice. The following morning, the restaurant felt different, though nothing had physically changed. Patrons went about their business, unaware that the previous evening had become a lesson in courage, justice, and moral authority. Maya sat quietly at her table, journal open, writing down her reflections. The words poured out, chronicling fear, humiliation, and the decisive intervention of Raid al-Faris, the Arab billionaire CEO whose presence had rewritten the narrative of the night. Raid entered one last time, his tailored suit catching the soft sunlight as he moved through the space with effortless authority. His gaze met Maya's, warm yet commanding, a reminder that true power carried responsibility and empathy. "You've grown since yesterday," he said softly. "Not in years, but in understanding. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is action in the face of it. Strength is not the absence of vulnerability, it is rising despite it. And influence," he paused, letting the weight of his words settle, "is meaningless unless it is used to protect, to uplift, and to act for what is right." Maya looked up, tears welling but not of sorrow, of gratitude, clarity, and newfound empowerment. I understand, sir. Thank you for showing me that." Raid smiled faintly. "Remember this, when the world conspires to humiliate or diminish someone, justice is not passive. It is created by those willing to act. Your voice, your choices, your actions, they matter. And you now know that morality and courage are as powerful as wealth or status." He gestured toward the corner where the instigator had been quietly informed of their wrongdoing by the manager. No scolding, no spectacle, just firm, unshakable accountability, ensuring the consequences were clear and lasting. Raid straightened, walking toward the exit, the sunlight streaming behind him like a cinematic halo. His presence had reshaped the room, the evening, and most importantly, Maya's sense of self. She realized that life would always present challenges, but she had witnessed firsthand how decisive moral action could transform fear into confidence, cruelty into understanding, and vulnerability into resilience. As he stepped out into the bustling city streets, Maya whispered to herself, clutching her journal, "Courage and integrity, that's real power." True power is measured not by wealth, influence, or authority, but by the courage to act for justice, the compassion to protect the vulnerable, and the wisdom to wield influence ethically. Ray Dolfaris' intervention proves that even a single decisive act can dismantle cruelty, uplift the downtrodden, and inspire hope. Humiliation, fear, and deception may exist in the world, but justice is created by those who refuse to remain silent, who rise with moral clarity, and who choose action over indifference. This story reminds us that integrity, empathy, and courage are contagious, rippling outward to touch lives in ways unseen but profoundly transformative. The true measure of humanity lies in how we use our power to shield the vulnerable, restore dignity, and ignite hope where despair once stood.